To begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from where we join this call. For me, I acknowledge that and pay our respects to the Camaragal people and their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to Ransomware Attacks, New Threats, New Laws, with the subtitle, Not If, But When. My name is Marina and I'm the President of the Australian Society for Computers and the Law. We're an interdisciplinary, intergenerational think tank. Our mission is to create sustainable law, technology and society through education and policy. Thank you for joining us today. Today, this event is part of our education program. Today, we are delighted to co-host this important event with our friends and colleagues at the Australian Computer Society, CAUDIT, the Council of Australasian University Directors of IT, and the Australian Information Security Association, with special thanks to Dr. Ian Opperman, Damien Manuel, Greg Sawyer, and Mark Portlock for making this happen. To our audience, please keep your cameras and mics off and post your questions in the chat function. We'll answer as many questions as we can. Now to introduce our moderator, Richard Buckland. He is a Professor of Cybercrime, Cyberwar, Cyberterror, Cybersecurity, Cyber Everything at the University of New South Wales. He's also a Visiting Professor of Cybersecurity at Taylor's University and the National University of Malaysia. Richard makes an exceptional contribution to cybersecurity education and training in Australia, and amongst his many leadership roles is the Director of SECedu, Australia's leading cybersecurity education network. Richard, now it's your turn to take the virtual stage. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Marina. That was a nice intro. Welcome, everyone. I understand there's more than 400 people here at the moment, or who should be here. Why is this event so popular, so interesting? Well, ransomware, it's a new way of monetizing cybercrime, and it's affecting people we know. It's massive and it's big, and I don't think there'd be a board director, there shouldn't be a board director that doesn't at night sometimes worry about what would happen if their firm was hit by ransomware. So we're lucky today to have some fantastic experts across a range of disciplines to share their experience, their insights, to fill you in if you're this is new to you, and to answer your questions if you're a bit further along but have specific questions. We're going to do today as a panel session, and I would really encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat. We probably won't get to them all, given there's so many of you. So do like and somehow acknowledge the questions you particularly like so I can see them and make my best efforts to get them answered. But before we start throwing the floor to you guys and hearing your questions and answering them, I'd like to introduce our panel of esteemed experts and let them each talk briefly in turn so you get to know them in their area of expertise. So we'll start with Ty Miller. Ty is the Managing Director of Threat Intelligence, who many of you probably know. They're specialists in the areas of security, automation, penetration testing, incident response, and strategic security. He is the person behind Evolve Security Automation Platform. He's on Black Hat Asia Review Board. He's a long-term presenter and trainer for more than a decade at Black Hat USA and Black Hat Europe, and has many other, he's well known, he's appeared, I'm pretty sure I've seen you at RuxCon. Ty is just everywhere. His fingerprints are everywhere. He's highly technical and very wise. He's also on the CREST ANZ Board of Directors. Ty, can you just describe for everyone now what the current landscape is, what it looks like at the moment in terms of ransomware in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for having me. It's certainly a very interesting topic that has just gone absolutely nuts over the last, especially over the last year or so. It's, yeah, look, I mean, having been in the industry for about 20 years, pretty much started my career in cybersecurity, and I can tell you right now that we live in the most malicious threat landscape that I've ever seen. And to put that into perspective from both what I've seen in my business, but also, when we run our blackout training, I also want to get those sort of insights from different organisations, from the students across both the US and Europe as well. And ultimately, they're all seeing the same thing, which is good to know, because it sort of confirms what we see. But basically, to put it into perspective, since about sort of May last year, we've been doing back-to-back incident response engagements for, multi-million-dollar ransom and extortion campaigns, and across pretty much every sector as well. And what we've really been noticing is sort of some of the shift in some of the attack techniques that are being used as a part of the ransomware breaches. So when you have a look at, say if you go before the last year and a half or 2 years, really a lot of the ransomware attacks that we saw were very focused on individuals and getting scale from how many individuals that they infect. And, that was obviously very successful, with, each campaign pulling in somewhere between $100 and $150 million every year, which, isn't bad for any business. And most of that's profit, which is always good. Or
in this case, bad.
Well, it's bad for us, yeah. Good for the cybercrime industry. What we've been seeing is a combination of infiltration techniques followed by, that ransomware attacks. And where that becomes quite important is that, these guys are, quite commonly international cybercrime gangs infiltrating organisations. Typically, that's through two common attack vectors. That one is just leaked passwords, and then they just go and log into the organisation. The other one we've seen is through remote code execution vulnerabilities, so critical vulnerabilities that you can break into the infrastructure. And that's interesting because that was sort of the technique early on in sort of the early 2000s. It then shifted to what we call client-side exploits, where they actually attack those end users, so those individuals. And then they've actually shifted back towards that technique, and it's become very effective, where they've combined, the attack techniques, where they're infiltrating the organisation, escalating their privileges, and we're actually seeing a lot of penetration testing style techniques being used to escalate their privileges in an environment. Getting that domain admin access, for example, and then just shutting down the entire business in an instant by distributing ransomware everywhere. That then obviously puts them in a position where they can ask for much, much larger ransomware or ransoms, as well as, and that's what we were seeing sort of early on in the COVID phases, just large ransoms. It then trended towards stealing the data first, encrypting everything, holding them to ransom, and extorting them. And with some of the investigations that we were managing, actually every day leaking data to one client, to try and put pressure on the organisation to actually pay the ransoms. And
so that's it's very interesting. Just super quick. Why do you think why is ransomware now so big? Why has it become the new thing? Why is it always in the news? Why is it most of the attacks we read about now involve ransomware? Just like in 10 seconds, can you say what is it in a word?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately, in the 2000s, it was really around fraud and financial theft, really. And there's only so much of that you can do. Whereas when you put ransomware at scale, it's all fully automated from that payment perspective. There's a much bigger target of people. So this is when you're looking at that scale of attacking individuals, you know, you start to get that scale. It's more anonymous from the attacker's perspective. And interestingly, when you're looking at these extortions and you know, corporate ransomware payments, it's actually shifting back towards that, but they've just caught on to the fact that really everyone is so underprepared for cyber attacks.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, ultimately, you know,
so it's the deadly.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ty. My internet connection here is a bit bad, and I missed your last bit. I thought you'd stop. But I think that's it. It's the deadly combination of those two, isn't it? That on the one hand, it's like the perfect crime. It's scalable, and there's so much money. And on the other hand, and low risk of being caught. And on the other hand, it's easy. Because people are vulnerable left, right, and centre. And I guess in the old days, everyone was vulnerable, but the consequence of being vulnerable was you were hacked and something happened and the IT people were worried and other people were worried, but it stayed private inside the company and maybe a cost of doing business. Now you are hacked and ransomware. Now you might have to do compulsory reporting, you're in the news, you have to advise your clients and customers, and there's big money involved. They're not just after your money by stealing your money, they're extorting more money from you. And so it is the perfect crime, and they've caught on to it. And I guess that makes sense in the same way we see COVID mutating. It's just ruthless evolution of crime here. The successful, low-cost, high-return strategies dominate and beat the other ones, and it's ransomware at the moment. Thank you so much, Ty. We'll come back to you at the end and ask you what you think the future is going to look like. So I'd love questions in the chat about that too. Our next panelist is James. James is from ARNET. That's the, all academics here will know that. They do the research, infrastructure, backbone, IT. They're one of the earliest connections to the internet in Australia, if not the earliest, I think. But ARNET are fantastic and we love them dearly. James is the General Manager of Security Operations, and he's built or come in and help run the SOC, which is the Security Operations Centre, which is dealing with crises when they happen. And today I'm hoping we'll talk about three things. One is, what's the situation now? So what does ransomware look like? Two is, how did we get here? So what are the weaknesses that let us be caught by ransomware? And then three is, so what should we do? How do we respond? You've just got that terrible email or advice. What should you do now? You're a board member or whoever. There is no really clear playbook out there. So I'm hoping we'll pick everyone's brains. And James, in particular, I'm hoping we'll pick your brain. What do you think people get right, and what do people get wrong in your extensive experience when they are hit by ransomware?
Thanks, Richard. And just to echo, I guess, Ty at the start, really excited to be part of the panel discussion and looking for some curveball questions, no doubt from yourself, Richard, but also the fellow attendees. As you mentioned, ARNET is Australia's academic and research network. We're essentially a telco provider for a lot in the sector. And we've just been pivoting more recently to provide, I guess, some security services, primarily in my space is around the SOC. And so we've been working a lot with a number of university institutions around monitoring and protecting their environments. And I would say that us as a sector, talking about whether it's the universities or schools, etc., are often a key target because we sort of produce and maintain and have access to a lot of IP. Think about research data, COVID that's come into focus more recently. And then also their size, disparate geographic locations, and the fact that universities and schools and education and research institutes are all built on the purpose of openness and collaboration. So again, a good target for cyber threat actors that are looking to get in, because there's just a lot of different pathways, whether it's through students or researchers or staff. So we've seen a lot of that coming into some of the environments that we're monitoring against. That said, as you were talking a little bit earlier with the discussion with Ty, it's really around financial, we've seen a lot of criminal actors come into play. Where can they make a buck or two? And then therefore our role is to work with institutions around not only around monitoring and detecting, but how do we actually help with improving or enhancing their cybersecurity postures, to act a lot more of a deterrent, and then also assist them once we do identify potential threats around their mitigations and response processes. So I think at the start, Richard, you talked a little bit about what do we do right or wrong, or what have we observed, and without going into the minutiae, some things that we have seen as we onboard and integrate our processes from a SOC perspective with institutions is really around having a plan in place. So, you've got an incident management and response plan. You know who the key players are, your contacts are across your organisation. Who do you contact for help? Go off to validate whether there's legitimate or illegitimate or inappropriate activities happening, and that might be across both networks and infrastructure. So the last thing you want to be doing in a crisis is fumbling away through your contact list and doing some calls whilst you're seeing a whole rampant sort of activity occur. And it's not so much about what we see happening wrong, but it comes down to that, I guess, the commentary around preparedness. So we spend a lot of time, again, when we onboard institutions into our SOC service for monitoring is what are the key assets and crown jewels, what's really important to the organisation, so we can apply some level of severity and priority upon what we see. Talked a little bit about having a plan. A plan's great, but you need to be able to execute and practice the plan. So whether that's tabletops or technical simulations, working with your third parties. Also think about PR. I think a lot of the times, we were saying you can do things, it was sort of in the privacy of the organisation. These days, it's all played out in public. So having a bit of a comms plan or a PR plan and who needs to be involved with that is really key. Again, the last thing you want to be worried about is all these rumours starting to fire up. And we find when there's a vacuum of information out there, people seem to populate that with whatever they see or hear. And then lastly, which is, threat intelligence and ties, organisation and company plays a key role in this, but having relationships and maybe potentially agreements already in play with key providers from a retainer perspective or something similar. Again, during a crisis, the last thing you want to be doing is working through legal to get contracts in place. So look, I'll pause it there, Richard, but there's just some initial thoughts from my end.
James, that's gold. That is absolute gold. I hope everyone was writing that down. I could see Ben smiling and nodding. And he's been in hundreds of breaches, and he'll talk about that in a second. But look, I've been involved in, compared to Ben and Ty and you, a relatively small number of breaches. But I can say what they have in common. Step one is always panic. There's this sense of panic, and it's horrible. And I feel so sorry for the people. And they cannot. You'd have to be superhuman to make rational and wise decisions at that time. So this plan ahead, we always tell the students that with ethics, the last thing you want is to be dealing with an ethical dilemma while it's happening. You want to have given it some thought in advance because you're not in a good state of mind. So planning is fantastic, and then checking the plan and testing it and make sure it works and all that other stuff, comms, and then having relationships built. That is exactly what I was hoping you would say, and it makes complete sense, and it means so much coming from you with your experience. Thanks, James. And look, anyone that has questions for James, please keep them coming in the chat. We've seen lots of good ones already. Keep them coming, and all the people on the panel will be able to answer the questions we ask from there. So next, we're going to hear now from Lyria. It's an absolute delight to introduce Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses. She's the director of the Allens Hub for Law, Technology and Innovation. She's a professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW. She's the co-lead in the Law and Policy theme in the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. She's a member of the Institute for Cybersecurity. She has her fingers in every pie and is one of the most knowledgeable and wise people I know. She also teaches. She teaches regulation for cybersecurity, including to some of my own security engineering students who thinks she is absolutely wonderful. So, Lyria, thank you for joining us today as our legal, well, as one of our legal gurus, Ben as well, of course. Could you just tell us briefly, what do you think, what's the current legal position for a company that's just received a ransom demand?
Okay, so it's quite it's neither simple nor clear, unfortunately. So there's some sort of legal risks no matter what you do. At the point you've got a ransomware demand, there's going to be negative impacts on the company. So there's the potential that there could be a suit against even directors personally for breach of their directors' duties, which include cybersecurity related obligations. So the directors could potentially be liable no matter what path is taken, but perhaps more so where the path taken ends up causing more harm to shareholders and so forth. There are legal risks if you pay. So money laundering is a criminal offence, funding terrorism is a criminal offence, and the Charter of the United Nations Act makes it an offence to transfer assets where there's a UN Security Council sanction in place. Now, some of those apply more often than others, right? So you're always effectively, financing crime in some form when you pay a ransom. Inevitably, they're going to use that money to leverage further attacks. You're not always funding terrorism, or it's very hard to know when you are and when you aren't. The ACS, the advice is always do not pay, but of course, many people do. And then there's all these potential offences. Now, there's a possible defence to all of these. So you can always argue duress, right? So you can say, well, I paid, but I only paid because I had to, and there was no other way to render the effect ineffective and avoid all of this other harm that could have arisen. So I'm not saying those will always succeed, but they've got to be on people's minds, I suppose, as they're making those kinds of decisions. And it's always a good idea to keep track of contemporaneous circumstances that explain a payment if you make one, so that you can later on, use the memo if you like, if such a prosecution should proceed. Rare, but nevertheless a risk. Now, if the data does all go, vanish, or get stolen, made public when it's confidential and so forth, there's a whole variety of other legal risks. Now, they can arise even if you pay, because there's no guarantee that if you pay, the data will actually be decrypted, kept confidential, and so forth. But, which legal risks arise is very much going to depend on the circumstances. For some organisations, so for example, law firms who often make promises in relation to keeping their clients' information confidential, there could be breach of contractual, professional, or other obligations of confidence. So there's sort of specific risks in some circumstances. But any organisation that's made security-related promises or secrecy-related promises in its contracts with other organisations can also potentially be at risk if it can no longer keep those promises. And it depends on how those contracts have been framed. There's potential to breach consumer law if you've misrepresented the security status of your organisation, so or your product if it's in the market. It might mean that, if you've sort of if as a result of the attack, there's actually consumer devices in the market that are now compromised. Potentially you've breached consumer guarantees around acceptable quality. If it's cyber physical, if it interacts with the world like a drone, potentially it could even be a safety defect because it might cause physical harm and so forth. There's a whole range of possibilities, not all of which will apply to all circumstances. Finally, I suppose there are legal risks if you become a vector for an attack on another party. So I'll leave those aside because that gets a bit complicated. But the bottom line is there's no real wins here. Organisations face legal risks no matter what they do, but nevertheless, the laws aren't necessarily helping either. In other words, they're not necessarily helping the government understand strategically what's going on, so that law enforcement and other agencies can better respond. And they're not stopping ransoms being paid, which of course goes on to fund future attacks. So it's not necessarily well-targeted law, but it is a minefield that companies have to navigate.
Yeah, and isn't that just so familiar to people in cybersecurity that the laws can sometimes be very annoying and have a nasty sting for you, and that's much more common than the laws being wonderful and helping and sorting things out for you. And I'm hoping the current spate of consultation and changes to law is hopefully we're going to move in a more positive direction. Thank you, Leary. That was a great summary. Can I just impose on you again, although I know we've run out of time, but I would love to know your thoughts about the current policy ideas. Like what is sort of on the table for dealing with this legally going into the future? Maybe even if you could just name them, and then people can ask questions in the chat and we can go over them all in more detail then.
Okay, one quick highlight, just overall statement about it first, is there's a whole range of cybersecurity policies, and it's very much an evolving space with different parts of government working on different pieces, whether it's protect, disrupt, detect, respond, and so forth. But just looking at what the government is doing in the policy space that is focused on the ransomware problem. They've set up a task force. There are critical infrastructure reforms that will affect some sectors. The government has stated it's considering a mandatory ransomware notification scheme. Labor has actually introduced such a scheme, although one's hopes for anything bipartisan there might be affected by the framing on which that was done, and I can talk more about that. Labor's also got a lot of other ideas and has released a policy paper. ASPI has released a paper as well with slightly different ideas, variations on a theme. The main sort of policy idea, I think, that's probably going to gain the most traction is this idea of having some kind of mandatory reporting scheme.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And we're being flooded, or not flooded, but we're getting questions on exactly this right now. So this will be something we can go into in more detail. Thank you, Luria. That was fantastic. And we were going to play bingo or some sort of drinking game as soon as someone asked the question about should we pay ransoms or not. And I'm really pleased to say that it has broken and the question has been asked. And I think that will have to be, once we go to the panel, the first question we deal, pay or no pay. And I don't think we're going to have satisfactory or happy answers for anyone here today, but at least we'll have more informed answers and you can make sensible choices and start to think about them in advance. Now, our fourth panelist, and we saved you till last, Ben, but that is a climax, is Ben DeMarco. So Ben is the lead of Willis Towers Watson's Australian New Zealand Cyber Technology Risk Team. You may well have encountered him before. He's a very public figure and active in the community. They are insurance. They're specialists in insurance, consulting, assessment, and for international, domestic, you name it. A huge company. Am I right in saying one of the 4 biggest in the world? Would that be right, Ben? Have I remember? Yeah, thank you. He's more than 13 years of legal and advisory experience. He's acted in more than 200 data breaches. May none of us ever experience 200 data breaches. And he is provided advice, calm advice in that time of panic on triage, privacy, strategic, claim support, and dealing with the aftermath. So he's very welcome here today. And Ben, I'm going to listen with itching ears as well. You're the National Cyber Risk and Governance Stream for the Australian Societies of Computer and the Law, the head of that, and you are also the Queensland Chair. So, insurance. So we've already had some questions about insurance. Does insurance help? Does it harm? What's the current state of insurance with cyber? How many people take it out? What's it covered? What's not covered? And where's it likely going? I know you can't detail it all now, but the things you say will frame the questions that we can ask.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Richard. Before I do that, just one thing Larry mentioned that I'd like to underline. She talked about just how challenging this space is, but the word is often also how evolving it is. So 2 recent examples, we've had some issues with some of our clients the last few weeks where they've had to think about contractual obligations for cybersecurity or traditional confidentiality obligations. How does that interplay with the whole issue of data breaches, loss of data, data exfiltration? And we're seeing a lot of revisiting of the global sanctions regimes, particularly off the back of Garmin last year. So it's hard now, it's getting harder, and it probably stays that way for a short period of time. I'm pleased you made the reference to insurance because I think insurance is a fascinating microcosm through which to look at cyber risk at the moment. And one of the things that you'll see a lot in the media is reports about there being a cyber insurance crisis, difficulty getting in cyber insurance, carriers being quite worried, being quite scared. With most things in the media, there's a grain of truth and there's also a little bit of hype that sits there. So I'll try and navigate that for you very quickly. What's really happened is insurance, particularly cyber insurance, has always sat where the rubber hits the road. When you have the losses, when you have the events, you go to the insurer, you make the claims. They have to help you triage the incident. They have to help you meet the costs and the losses. What that means is they get a very, very ground up view of when the loss tails start to change. And certainly the last 18 months, we've seen a lot of the loss tails change. Ransom demands are much bigger now. I can tell you from just my own contacts in the industry, there's been 2 payments of ransoms in the last month, which have been for more than $10 million within the Australasian region. If I were to talk to you 2 years ago, if I said there were 2 for $500,000, we would have thought that was really, really big. So it's an exponential growth. And because of that, we've got this significant problem of if you're the insurer and you have the risk of 2, 3, 4, 5, $10 million losses landing in a single month, suddenly your book goes from being profitable to unprofitable. And suddenly you get very, very worried and very, very nervous about who you insure, how you think about the maturity of the risk, and how you think about the types of organizations that you want to work with and partner with. Because of that, there's a lot of focus at the moment with insurers around understanding what is a cyber mature organization. And that's, I think, a bit of a wider trend that we're seeing in the industry. I think we've turned a lot of the old assumptions on their head the last 18 months. Before, we just thought if you've got the right tools, if you've got someone that's a CISO, you've got a couple of bits of paper out the back door for the governance and other policies, you're fine. That just doesn't work. We've got to be much more close. We've got to be much more ground up on controls. We've got to think about the lived exercises. We've got to think about the behaviours. We've got to think about incident response and resilience. And that's really where I think cyber insurance is going. They're demanding a lot more of that information. They're focusing a lot more on making sure organisations can meet those requirements. And the ones that can meet those requirements are fine. What we're also highlighting is, I think, how big the uplift gap has been within Australasia. And that's a very big part of what we're trying to do with both cyber insurance, but more generally how we support and how we work with organisations. Trying to put all that together for you, I think, at least in my mind, what cyber insurance is about at the moment is you've got to do the hard work. You can't just have a proposal document where you give these wishy-washy yes-no answers that don't make sense, that have inconsistencies. Yes, you say you've got some type of outsourced SOC that you're working with, but you can't describe who it is, what the SLAs are, what those types of terms are. You've got to actually be able to take people on the journey and explain what you want, and you've got to be able to be more joined up. If you do that, cyber insurance works. I think it's a very, very important mechanism, but it just highlights the whole issue that we're going through at the moment, which is we've got to be much more serious, we've got to be much more focused, and we've got to be much more strategic about understanding cyber risk as an end-to-end exposure and end-to-end problem. I know you indicated you also were looking at me to give some views on where we think things are going. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, that's spooky because that's exactly what I was about to ask. You remembered that little chat. I'm so impressed. Yes, please.
The 3 trends that have really stuck in my mind, and I think Ty alluded to this really, really well. Ransomware's historically been an availability attack. It's simply about, I get this onto your system, I deploy it, you don't get the data assets back unless you pay me, I give you the decryption key. Now that's difficult, that's very challenging for organizations to manage, but it's now much more of a wider risk in terms of we see these double, triple extortions. So very simply, a double extortion will also have exfiltration. I'll steal your data, I'll take it out, I'll house it somewhere. If you don't pay me, I'll publicly release it or I'll give it to third parties that you don't want to see it. And the third limit of that now is if you don't pay me, I'm going to go and individually tell your clients that I've got all of your data, what the assets are, and I'll see if they're going to make the payment. So we're starting to see lots of trends of that with supply chain and so forth. What that means is it's a huge reputational risk that we're trying to manage. What it also means is that the levers for making us pay are very, very different because for many organizations, yes, we might be confident we can recover eventually, but take a law firm, take a financial services firm. If your top 100 clients realize you've lost all of their data, the reputation and the other impacts are just fundamentally catastrophic. And that's what I think is driving part of it. Second thing I think is really important to think about in this space here is ransomware attacks have always been about leverage. The malicious actors have always looked at what is the leverage that they can get on you in order to make you deal with them and also to facilitate the payment. And when you start to think about it in those types of terms, COVID is a really interesting environment to think about. We're very, very remote. We're very, very locked down. There's a much more immediate connection now between an IT system failure and financial loss. For most organizations, most of the business continuity modeling that they did, how they tried to model this, it's completely wrong because it just doesn't think about what those COVID impacts mean. Because of that, again, trying to say pro tanto, you won't deal with a malicious actor, you won't make a ransomware payment. It's a much more challenging situation than what it historically was. Last thing that I'll say too, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that ransomware has been going darker the last couple of years, and we're starting to see issues around compromises of infrastructure providers, major hospitals, major utilities. That's a really concerning trend in some ways, and I think Colonial Pipeline, even though they never got into the OT of colonial pipeline. It highlights the real concern and so forth there. But we actually are starting to see some of the systematic problems that sit around ransomware. And the fact is, if I get a major IT provider, if I get a major utility provider, if I get someone of that nature, I cause huge downstream impact. So those are the three trends for me that I think are emerging that we'll have to keep trying to manage over the current period.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Because those three trends imply a whole lot of things, don't they? Once you start thinking about that, the future looks very different to now. And this move to darker is particularly interesting. And I think we should probably start with the question of should we pay or not? You know, what's the issue there? And Ben, someone's already asked you to think about to what extent do insurers have some say in whether people will pay or not. So the darkness is, it's like you're traveling through Mexico and some bandit holds you up and extorts money from your relatives to free you. And in the old days, it was very civilized and you'd get the money and they'd free you and that'd be fine. Then it was chopping off fingers and then it was all sorts of other things. And then it just got rough. So if you're not going to pay the ransom, then the bad guy is just going to escalate the badness. And I've been on panels where people have said, well, we'll never pay, you know, Toll says, we'll never pay a ransom. I once was on a panel and said, in a public panel with lots of people looking, and I said, they gave me a scenario and said, I won't pay, I wouldn't pay. And they said, really? And I said, really? And they said, what if the ransom person said this XYZ about your children? And I suddenly said, oh, yeah, I'd pay, damn it. And so they just have to get nastier and nastier until you pay. And they're discovering all these new levers, as Ben's outlined. Just, you know, well, all right, we'll attack your operations. All right, we'll attack the value of your information. All right, we'll attack your reputation and your intangibles. All right, we'll attack your clients. All right, we'll attack your shareholders. All right, we'll attack the stock exchange. All right, we'll attack. So they will just go, you know, we'll attack your national infrastructure. We'll kill people. I was having informal conversations with some people from government in some way, all saying, of course, we will never, ever pay. But of course, as soon as life or security is involved, then everything's different. It's a new game. It's very hard to say you won't pay. When the bandits start sending more and more extreme letters, you'll eventually pay. So we're almost training the bandits to be darker. And I think COVID's a bit like this. You know, as long as we have half effective vaccines to half the population, all we're doing is we're training the virus to get worse. So it's a very interesting question. So I'd love to throw it over to the panel and everyone from the audience too. The first thought that comes through your mind after that shock of panic, maybe I should pay. Maybe I should pay. What do you guys think? Should they pay? What are the constraints on them? And what would you do? Start with Ty.
All right, I'm happy to put my hand up for that one. So as I mentioned, we've dealt with a lot of these over the last year and a half. And it really comes into down to three categories of organisations, and it differs as to the response that you're going to take. So the first would be mature enterprises and government departments from a security perspective and also a compliance perspective or a policy and process perspective, I guess. And those companies, those large organisations who have backup solutions already in place, they have disaster recovery plans already in place, they've got incident response teams, they've got business continuity plans, all of that's ready to go and they're prepared, as we were talking about earlier. You know, those organisations, and to be honest, that's the majority of the organisations we've been dealing with, are in that situation where it's not even an option to pay. You know, like these guys come in, they encrypt everything, hold them to ransom, even extort them. Actually, extortion's a little bit different, but with the ransoms, most of these companies who are large enough to be able to pay these multi-million-dollar ransoms have backup solutions in place, and they just, you know, restore their backups and they get their environment under control. So there's not a huge need for those organisations to pay, right? So the next one is immature startups and SMBs who tend to have next to no security, next to no knowledge about, you know, cyber. They may not even have backup solutions in place. So one particular organisation we assisted, they got hit by ransomware. You know, they had this, you know, it was only a small ransom. I think it was about $700. And they went to their IT, their outsourced IT, and said, all right, can you just restore, you know, back over our systems? And the IT guy said, been meaning to tell you this, but your backups haven't been working for the last 6 months, right? And at that point, they were stuck, right? And it's at that point, Richard, that you were sort of mentioning, where if you get put into a situation where you have no choice, then really you have to start then weighing up, well, really, what are the impacts to, you know, the global ransomware industry if I pay this $700 versus I actually lose all of my clients and my business and potentially my house if I don't pay this $700 ransom. And I don't think anyone on the call is going to say, don't pay it, right? So, and that's one person, and when you look at it from that scale perspective, obviously that's going to turn into millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is just one payment. But no one's going to argue with that organisation not to pay, right? And then you've got really the ones that are concerning, and really what we need to try and get under control is immature enterprises and government departments, where, and primarily enterprises and even critical infrastructure, where they don't have good security, they don't have backups, or their backups don't work. And because they're such large organisations, they get the multi-million-dollar ransom payments, you know, whether it's the $10 million, or, you know, we've seen a whole bunch of them that are $50 to $70 million recently. And when they get into those situations, that's where, you know, we're talking about these big one-off payments that are really funding the ransomware industry. And again, when it comes down to it, they're actually not in a very different position to that small startup. We're just talking about a bigger problem and a bigger amount of money. And, you know, if you look at, all right, well, if we don't pay this ransom, our enterprise, you know, can potentially collapse. Then we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs that are suddenly going to disappear. That's going to affect thousands of people's lives, you know, or even hundreds of thousands of people's lives. You know, that's a much bigger decision when you start looking at it through that lens rather than just don't pay the money, you know, it's bad, right? So, and as you said, you know, when you start looking at it through the eyes of, well, this is actually going to affect all of my employees, all of their families, potentially then losing their houses or something along those lines, it's not as simple as just not paying. That's
right. I really like your classification into these three groups. And I also loved your optimism at implying the first group was quite large. You know, just from audit reports and things, I'm not sure that many government departments would fall into that first group. And maybe they do, and I just don't know. I think the group is disturbingly big.
Yeah, and look, when I say mature enterprises from a security perspective, I mean relative. I think all of them are pretty horrible from what I've seen, and you know, that fundamentally comes down to a lack of security budgets, lack of security resources, lack of security skills, 100%. You know, and just the sheer amount of assets that need to be protected by a small number of people.
And that's what I think we'll talk about next time, after we've finished dealing with this notion of, we're going to do ghost of Christmas present, ghost of Christmas past, and ghost of Christmas future. So we're looking now, you've just got the demand. After this, we'll then look at, well, what if we could travel back in time a year or two before? What should we have done? And this maturity, we really want to move from the second group into the first group as quickly as we can. Thank you, that was great. I'm sure everyone else has things to say too. So, and there's lots in the comments. I should say, by the way, Faye, I'm not sure if that's how I pronounce your name, Faye, Faye Locke. There's there's a survey that's come that says Australian organisations are the most willing in the world to pay a ransom if they're hit by a ransomware attack. That's the Australian spirit, isn't it? We're very easygoing and accommodating. It's lovely. So if there's a link, if you could post that, Faye, that would be very interesting to read. On the panel, just wave if you, I'm sure you all have something to say. Ben.
Yeah, so I'll take 3 points off that. I really enjoyed your comment at the start around the directors' discussions, don't they pay ransom? And I do a lot of work facilitating cyber tabletops. And one of the things that always amuses me is you'll have these 2-hour discussions when you get everyone in the room and they'll talk about their extortion policies, what they can or what they can't do. And in some ways, we've almost turned this into a bit of a nonsense. No one ever wants to pay a ransom. You only pay a ransom if you've got no other choice. And I don't care what type of organisation you are, if it becomes a going concern problem, you will facilitate it, you will find the right third parties that can help you, and it will happen. And that's a really interesting, I think, underlying note to have, because so much of our effort goes into should you or shouldn't you. I think the bigger piece is, well, what happens around that? How do you actually engage with the malicious actor? How do you do that decryption work? How do you do that restoration work? Because all of that is something that I often find is chronically undercooked, and all the challenges and so forth that go there. You have an organisation that has a crisis. They've got these elaborate thought processes for how the CMT does the initial thinking, but nothing that goes through to the end of, okay, well, now we've got the key, what are we going to do? How are we going to go through those types of processes? A second point that was made was, can you trust them? I've always found this to be really interesting because despite the article that was shared, a few years ago, the statistics were that Australians paid much rarer than other organisations. So a lot of people said that if you're in the US, about 70 to 80% paid. We were only closer to about 25, 30%. So there was a significant degree of scepticism and there was a significant concern. What I think has changed in the last 12 to 18 months is the proof has been in the pudding. The very large majority of people that have paid the ransoms have actually recovered. So I always like REvil, Revel, however you want to say them. They have a customer support function, and they will actually say that they have close to 100% customer satisfaction when you deal with them. So you have to accept that there is a service component that sits there, and the only reason why people are paying is because it works. If we have 20 companies in the next few months who pay and none of them actually recover, that damages the business model. So they are fundamentally incentivized to support you through that and to make sure that you do recover if you do make the payment. Last comment that I'll make, I think, is just some of the wider challenges around how we think about the ransomware risk and how we think about the ransomware exposure in this type of landscape. There's a huge focus around uplift, but one of the biggest things I think people here should think about, if we're at the board, the C-suite, the legal level, there does need to be a real focus on situational awareness. So understanding how these types of attacks play out, the types of support providers that you're going to need to deal with them. That's a really fundamental piece of the puzzle that, at least from the people that we speak to, they're not as aware of. And as I think Ty mentioned before, people get caught off guard. They don't realize that you've got to make these decisions within 12, 24 hours. You have to do the prep work, because if you put in that crisis environment without the prep work, as you said, you're never going to make the most ideal decision.
Thank you. They were 3 great points, Ben. And also, I've noticed that the rest of the panel is active in the chat, which is wonderful. And in fact, Faye's comment was actually a repost of something Lyria had posted before. So that's fantastic. So Ben, just a heads up to you, someone did ask about subrogation and third-party contracts. If you want to go and have a look at that, and if that's worth bringing back to the panel, please tell us. Lyria or James, did you have anything to say? I mean, we won't for every question ask everyone, but the pay or not thing, I think, cuts across every dimension here. James.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off, and I think, you know, I'm using the benefit of what Ty mentioned as well as what Benjamin mentioned as well. It's not black and white in terms of do you pay or don't you pay, and I think a lot of that has to come down to an assessment of, you know, can we actually restore? You know, is there other alternatives before we get to a point of payment? So I think that there isn't necessarily a black and white answer. So I'm going to skirt around that a little bit, which may be to the disappointment of the attendees in terms of not being that binary. But I think that there is an aspect of having a bit more of a thought out framework that organisations can do to prepare for that decision. And that really comes into that aspects of maturity. Do we take backups? What are all of our other security controls in place? So can we restore? Also think about, you know, we've been involved with a number of incidents where, you know, you often hear about the ransomware attacks that make the press that take a whole environment down and the whole organisation is offline. We've seen a lot of instances where it only impacts part of an organisation or part of a network or an environment. And then what's the decisions that are made there? Is it you take the whole business offline? Do you just work on that one component? Do you restore that component? Do you pay the ransom for that one component? So I think there's different variables, and I think having that thought through, again, to Benjamin's point, going, we haven't necessarily, when we talk about this, it's always about, do we pay ransoms or not? And we have got a policy position. I think we need to think about that. And this is more of a personal view, not necessarily representative of the sector, but certainly I think it's well worthwhile the exercise to think that through and what the impacts are. And the other thing I jumped on, which I think a lot of defence folk often refer to in military type situations, is more that interoperability. So working with your different vendors and providers, and then in a crisis situation, click your fingers, how do we get into that crisis response position? I would also say, lastly, in terms of, I think there's a really huge opportunity for government and policy to play a role here around supporting, whether it's all the way due to a sole trader or individual through to large organisations, around, do we have a much more consistent and uniformity approach to how we respond to these types of attacks? And I think that there's early workings, as Lyria mentioned, with the task force, etc. So I think that there's some work to be done in this space, but I'm an eternal optimist. So I think that there's some positivity to come from it, and some learnings. But I'll pause it there. As I said, not a black and white response, but certainly some work to be done to help us put ourselves and our organisations in the best position possible to make that decision. Touch wood, it doesn't happen, but should it arise.
James, that's fantastic. And black and white is not what's needed here. I think black and white is what gets us into this mess. And when you were talking, I was just so happy because you were talking about planning in advance, thinking about it, and really the sorts of things the others have been talking about too, of running it through in advance, doing a tabletop simulation, getting together. Don't just have a policy, sit down and do the what ifs. I'm sure all the consulting firms here are able to facilitate that, and I'm sure you can even just facilitate it yourself. But I just think the answer is always, as a university person, the answer is pretty much always education. So I reckon board education is a brilliant idea, and do an exercise and make them sweat and feel it. And there's the famous one that happened dark winter with, I think it was Reagan, where someone made him sit through a smallpox simulation. And after that, I'm pretty sure I've got the details right. After that dark winter, the enormous amounts of money were diverted to stop bioweapon attacks of the smallpox time. Unfortunately, that's exactly the wrong things we need to stop a pandemic, a flu pandemic. So that didn't help prepare for that. But just actually sitting through and experiencing it, that changes attitudes in a way that talking never does. You mentioned, well, in fact, everyone's sort of mentioning, when push comes to shove and it's an existential threat to you or your family or something like that, then, if the nastiness gets high enough, then you will pay. And then there's this question of, well, if we pay, we muck it up for everyone else because the thing's more like it's encouraging more attacks. And this is exactly the tragedy of the commons, isn't it? It's exactly that there's a small cost to me, there's a small cost to everyone for me doing this, but a big benefit to me, and that outweighs. And that's really where you want to have regulation or training or something. So I agree. And we'll throw to Lyria next to pick her thoughts on that. And Ben, I just realised you've escaped talking about the impact that insurers have in making the yes/no decision. So we might come back to you at the end, just super fast, to tell us what role insurers play. But Lyria, what are your thoughts? Optimism, regulation might help us here.
I want to riff off one of the points that James made, which is this idea that maybe we can think of government in more of a supportive role. So as I said, there's all this legal ambiguity not helping. If government can, if we think about the mandatory reporting scheme, so at the moment, the sort of main proposal on the table is mandatory reporting of ransoms that have been paid. So presumably that's an ex post thing, you pay the ransom and then you tell the regulator. But we could actually think of it potentially as something that you report actually when you get the demand, and that actually there'd be support services there to help you, on the basis that, and this would have to be very clear, that they don't then use the information you give them to prosecute you under one of those offences, right? So there'd have to be a sort of legal framework around, a safe framework around that, so that trust would have to be built that the information wasn't used against you, if you like. And there's some ideas around this sort of thing in the AFI report in terms of that sort of trust. But I do think that idea of, okay, you get a demand, there's an agency that is oriented to help you, there's legal protections in place that keeps the information you give them confidential in certain circumstances, and the bill also does some of that work. But it's earlier, it's at that point, and you get advice, right? Like not do or don't, not simplistic sort of do not pay, the current advice that the government's doing, but a little bit more, here's the consequences. Have you thought this through? Have you thought about the risk of that or the risk of this? And being much more honest and open. That would also then collect data, bear in mind, again, at a sort of high level, because you'd know not only what payments are made, but what happens when people don't pay. And you'd be able to get much better data on could they do the backups? What kinds of, when they did try to do it on their own and restore from backups, how often does that succeed, or under what conditions does that succeed? And you can then use the information you gather to give advice to people further down the line. So if we can construct that, it might be a little bit, utopian or something, but I think if we could construct something like that, it'd be very helpful.
That is a really helpful comment. So really reconsider the role of government in this and look for ways that they can play a different role that helps us, rather than just a yes, no, passing the law, but facilitating information flows, knowledge and wisdom. Thanks, Doreen. That's great. It just struck me too, thinking about the tragedy of the commons, that the ransomers themselves are relying on reputation, as James mentioned, that they have, or no, actually I think it was Ben, that because across the industry they have a reputation for paying, then it's in there, we all keep going and we all keep paying. Maybe one possible attack is to go in there with false flag operations and do some ransomware attacks and not pay ourselves, so people lose faith in the ransomers actually paying, much as we might have seen with NotPetya or something like that. That's just a mischievous one. I don't know how to pull that off, but some sort of making people lose confidence in the bad guys because they've got exactly the same problems we have.
Well, Richard, on that note, I agree with what Ben was saying. The only other slight deviation to that is when it's combined with extortion. So when it's a ransomware payment, yep, there's a pretty good chance of getting your data back. When you're starting down the extortion path and your data's already been stolen and they've given you proof that your data's gone, then that trust relationship is gone, right? And it's really interesting from a business model perspective to see the ransomware industry really move into that extortion space, because I actually think it's a bad thing from their side, for their business, that they are going to lose that faith in the industry and paying. Because when you've got the ransomware, you already have them, where you want them, right? You really don't need to actually steal that data, and all you're doing is backing the company back into a corner so far that they actually can't trust you anymore. And at that point, we just say, look, paying it's off the table. If they've stolen the data, they're extorting it. It's really, there's no reason that they won't release it after you've paid them. It also doesn't mean that they're not going to come back 12 months later and ask you for another payment, right? So I think, pure ransomware, I think, is that sweet spot of ransomware revenue. Extortion then goes a little bit too far, and I think that they're probably shooting themselves in the foot.
Thus nature balances herself. That is possibly the best comment that I've heard for many days. You put a big smile on my face. That's so interesting. I'm just going to have to think about that. And you make me want to go and speak to hostage negotiators and people like that now to understand this market, because you're right, they're moving from a safe market into one that's almost self-defeating. At university, we have a similar problem with cheating, just as a slight digression, that students pay money to get other people to write essays for them. None of us, of course, ever did that, but it has happened. And seriously, we wouldn't do that. But that was one business model, made them a little bit of money. But you might know what happened next is they wait a year or two now and then contact the student and say, you've graduated with a Bachelor of something that none of us in this room have. And I'm going to write to the university and tell them that you paid me to write all those essays, and you'll be charged with plagiarism, you'll be forced to leave the country, you'll be, And there's this awful extortion, and it leads to awful consequences to the students. But of course, they have no confidence, even if they pay the extortion, that the person won't come back next year or on-sell it to someone else. It's a nightmare scenario. So thank you so much, Ty. That was excellent.
Yeah, no worries. On the negotiations, I mean, that's absolutely another point, and I'd be keen to hear some of the thoughts on, from law enforcement around that. But, we've sort of seen that some of those negotiations, quite often when you're dealing with ransomware or extortions, you've got a 48-hour period to actually pay it. And those negotiations that you get into when you're dealing with extortion specifically are there to really initially buy time. I think, as Ben said, these companies are so underprepared that the time up front is really, really valuable to just get their ducks aligned and see what their options are, because they don't have it pre-planned as to what they're going to do. So, as James was saying before, so, having those negotiations, whether it's negotiating with them to get proof of decryption, that, how do I know that you can actually decrypt these files? And really, it's not a question of whether they can decrypt it. It's about letting the communications go further, extend that time out, and go, hey, you took 12 hours to get me my proof of decryption. We need more time to be able to, organise payments and things. And then you can start, if it's decided that you do want to go down that path of paying because your options aren't available to you, then you can start down that negotiation of how much you're going to be paying.
Just one thing to add there, because I think the ransomware negotiator is
so sorry, Ben, were you saying something?
Yeah, sorry, Richard. Just in terms of the ransomware negotiations, this I think is a really interesting thing that's also changed, whereas historically you had a couple of quite large globals that marketed themselves as specialist ransomware negotiators. They told you they'd get a demand down to 20, 30, 40, 50%, and they're almost being seen as a bit of a financial mechanism for how you manage the payment. Whereas, as Tig says, I don't think you've got the same degree of movement now in terms of a lot of the ransom attacks, and they're much more just about lining you up internally, helping you understand what the timing and what the process will be, and as he said, just giving you a little bit more time. So again, even all of the support providers are having these very evolving roles in the space at the moment.
Oh, it's so interesting. Thanks, Ben. I'm sorry if I spoke over you. I'm getting a juddery internet connection here, and I didn't hear your voice for the first few seconds. I was going to say we definitely need to get a negotiator and have another session and some expertise on this. And then our wonderful president has already posted in the comments that that's something we should do. And certainly, I think we've got some expertise here. I noticed in an earlier comment, Veronica Scott someone said a negotiator is normally able to get a discount. And Veronica, you replied saying in your experience, yes, it's possible. We'd love to know more, Veronica, and maybe you could reach out to us too if you have expertise in negotiation. You might be a good person to be involved in our discussion. That was incredibly useful. Can I give a summary of when I was going around asking people who've been through recent attacks to go back and reflect on the process of how they dealt with it, and this is the end of Christmas now, what they did from when they got that gut-sinking first email or message or just realization to the end when the whole thing's hopefully done. The steps that people said were, 1, panic. It was interesting to just notice how everyone panicked. It was that Roger Kipling would have been disappointed. There wasn't a level head in the room. The second tip, and so they said, do everything you can to avoid that phase or make it as small as possible, and presumably tabletop exercises, education, pre-thinking, and all that sort of stuff we're talking about reduces that. And Ben, I'll come back to you at the end of this because you've seen this and you can truth check this. Keep the decision team small. So you'll need a decision team. You're now signing up for a long period, say 6 weeks to months to possibly a year of pain now and ongoing work and dealing with it and tying all the loose ends off. there'll be a decision team that has to make decisions. Make sure they have the right amount of power and make it small, because there's just too many heads and too many opinions just makes the thing a mess. You need to be agile and move quickly and be properly resourced. The third advice was, again, we're hearing this from Ty and from Ben, delay. Your main thing is to try and delay as much as possible while you work out what the heck you're going to do, so you don't make dumb mistakes or make dumb decisions. So they suggest negotiate and join into negotiations just to get as much by time. You have to work out what you can live with and what your hard lines in the sand are if you haven't already worked that out, so you need a little bit of time. Third was, just they made comments about the awful current laws that if the bad guy tries to ransom you, tries to threaten you with, because they've stolen a whole lot of personal data, for most firms, you don't have to notify anyone. It's not notifiable because most large internet firms don't meet the turnover amount. And of course, state governments don't meet the requirements of the Privacy Notification Act. So you can sail under the radar a little bit and not have to put your hand up and tell people what's going on. What else? Try and get a sample from them to prove what they've got. And people are talking about this, the whole governance thing, making sure you know what they've got. They might have things you don't know they have. They might have things they don't realize how good they are. Try and quickly work out what you've lost at your end and get samples from them as proof, and then cross-check the samples you get with them with the data that you've got at your end that you think you've lost. And you're very happy if the two match, but more often than not, they give you in their sample the stuff you didn't even know you'd lost. And that's a good nudge to go back and look closer. Work out your comms, and James talked about this, get a good comms plan. It's too late almost now to start thinking about it, but it's certainly too late once they release the data or do the bad thing or carry out their threat. So start working on the comms now, and try and, if you can delay it long enough, try and you go public before they do. That's a better way of managing stakeholders and people's things. Be proactive there. Think deeply about whether you should notify the police or not. No insult to any police in the room here now, but no one had much use or joy in contacting the police, but it's probably something you need to do, and it might be for insurance purposes something to do. And hopefully the police, over time, if people keep contacting them, will build up capability in this area. Think about things like who else you have to advise, like the stock exchange and so on. And their main tip was, and now we're about to go back into Christmas past, think about all the things you should have done. And the top of everyone's list was, we should have deleted a lot of this data. We should, and one of them just said to me, their mantra was, he said, delete, delete, delete. That's what they've printed out now and stuck all around the office. So when you've got some data, if you don't need it, delete it. And we do a fun thing with our students when we're trying to teach them how to deal with people that own data lakes. And we say, think of something that you hoard. You know, everyone has something they hoard. I like hoarding particular sorts of books. Some people collect china or something like that. Identify something you hoard. When people tell me they don't hoard anything because they're digital, I say, do you collect music files or images, or, you know, everyone hoards something. Find something you hoard that other people would think was a bit weird, but you just can't bring yourself to throw away because you think one day I might need it or it might be useful. And then throw one of them away. Document yourself throwing it away and see how you feel. And actually throw it away, and you can't go back and get it. And after you've gone through that awful, horrible experience of throwing away something completely useless that you love dearly and think you might need, you will understand how someone who owns a data lake feels when you say to them, delete, delete, delete. And so you have a big challenge in persuading people to delete data, because maybe one day it'll be useful. You know, data's really good. It wants to be free. So, but delete, delete, delete was what they all wished they'd done. If we didn't have it, they couldn't have stolen it. Why did we keep all that stuff? And only keep one copy, for heaven's sake. Don't have it splattered all over the place. And the last thing was, again, James spoke about this in Thai too, I think. Know what you've got in advance. Know the crown jewels and the things you should be defending and you need to protect, and either delete them or protect them properly. But it's too late to start auditing what you've got after you've been breached. So that's the summary I got from talking to a couple of people. Ben, I'd love to know, what's your thought? Is that a good summary of the things that we missed there?
Yeah, I actually agree with a lot of what you said. Some nuance that I'll just give from my experience is I really like the message that you have to keep the team decisive. And while the people you spoke to said the team is small, I've actually seen that become quite challenging because a cyber event, a ransomware event is cross-functional. You need to have input from legal, you need to have input from the operational side, you need to have input from comms. So my message is actually the team should be cross-functional. There should be enough people to cover all your bases, but they need to come together, they need to work together. We should be practicing cyber-focused crisis management exercises. We should have a cyber-focused CMT. They should be able to work together. Completely agree with Agile, but the best way to be Agile is to have this as a lived experience, to make sure that the people have thought about this beforehand, they've had a chance to work through the dilemmas, the types of crisis elements. And I think that's much more effective than just having a small team, because I've seen situations where the small team has got halfway through an incident, they don't have the internal authority, and then got to go to a CEO, someone at board level, get them up to path, and then they've got someone poking holes at everything they've done the last 48, 72 hours. So that's the way that I balance it. I think as well that one of the things we often miss is, and Ty's a very good example here, there is an expertise that no internal IT team can have because they don't live, they don't breathe, they don't see these types of matters all the time. So we need to be able to find these experts. We need to make sure they're familiar to the organisation and that we can bring them on board very, very quickly. So to me, that's a pretty key piece that a lot of organisations struggle with, particularly large ones, because if you've got a large procurement function and you want to get a cyber infosec person in this afternoon, those two parts within the organisation often collide and often cause tension. Completely agree with stakeholders. Managing stakeholders, your internal employees, your employees, internal leadership, but also key clients, key people that you work with and collaborate. That's a huge part of how we stop some of the long tail risks that go with cyber events. And that should be through a corporate comms plan, but it should also be making sure you can draw in the people internally that can give you the expertise to drive that. So some examples, we have some organisations where their real concern is they've got 3 or 4 key customers. If their data gets breached, what are they going to do? So they've actually come up with plans that think about who are the people internally that own that relationship, how should they be engaging with them, and what should that look like? So that would be what I'd say there. Last 2 things I'd say, I completely agree with you about the over-collection of data and the challenges that we've got there. The caveat that I would say is speaking to lots and lots of different organisations, big data is still in the well. Lots of organisations have chief digital officers, chief innovation officers that are saying, collect more data. I'm going to use this for my data insights to redesign your product to help you drive your business plan for the next 2-3 years. So we've got to accept there are those headwinds. I think what you can have is you can have a more robust discussion about why you're collecting data, how you're going to use it, maybe try and get some of these data assets de-identified. But certainly I've seen a lot of situations where parts of the business have said, I don't think we need to keep these records, and other parts of the business said, no, we're collecting as much as we possibly can. So that live tension, I think, is a real challenge.
100%. That's spot on. Thank you. I think we're done with Christmas present, and if we can just go quickly into Christmas past, does anyone on the panel have anything that you wish to suggest that people regret once they're under an attack that they haven't done in advance? Oh, someone just said, Leah said, reporting to law enforcement. In New South Wales, it's an offence to conceal a serious indictable offence. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's part of stakeholder management and doing the right thing. But it's not necessarily going to advance your cause, but it might. Thanks, Leah. So, yeah, James, Ty, Liria, any things going backwards? Yep.
Yeah, look, I mean, just a simple comment is what we've seen. I mean, a lot of these places who are getting breached obviously have some pretty lax security controls, whether it's across the board or just in specific areas of the business. But one of the regrets that I've seen across a number of these security breaches is procrastination around implementing their security strategy. So they might have a security strategy, but they're so busy going out to market to find the best, the best bang for their buck or whatever it is. And they take a year or a year and a half to go through that and select vendors and get them implemented that they end up with nothing. And then there was one particular organisation that I had that conversation with their CEO, and then they went through the incident and we got them under control again and monitored them for a while to make sure that there was nothing they hadn't restored bad backups or malicious backups and those sort of things. And, you tend to find that for about 3 months, they're really focused on security, and then the interest starts to fade out and they get back to business as usual. And that same organisation then took another 12 months to actually then enhance their security again. But that was one of the regrets that I see consistently across a lot of these organisations, is just taking too long to actually make the decisions instead of just getting the security in. Because right now, and especially over the last 18 months, there's just not the time anymore. Things are just, as I said, we're in the most malicious threat landscape I've ever seen. There's massive financial gains to doing these breaches, bigger than we've seen before. So there's more motivation by attackers, and it's just going to accelerate, right? So there's just not the time that people have anymore to actually secure this stuff. So to procrastinate on implementing and selecting exactly the right technology with, the absolute maximum out of their security budget. Sure, it's important to make sure you're not buying something, a turkey, but, just getting the security in at this point and really getting visibility over the threats and the attacks is really a key thing.
That's right. It reminds me of the thing about I've got a hole in my roof, but I don't need to fix it now because it's not raining. There's no rush. And then, oh, it's raining. Well, I can't fix it now. It's raining. So yeah. Or perhaps more pithily, it's not a race. When things seem, when the threat doesn't seem big, you think you've got all the time in the world, and then it's only later on, looking back, that you realise I didn't have all the time in the world. I wish I'd used that time differently. Thank you. There's a good question here from Jamar, which relates to your comment just then, Ty. We also need to bear in mind that management buy-in is usually, not always, but usually driven by business value. What's the best way to set our cybersecurity strategy and resilience foothold so we don't end up fear-mongering the management budget approvers? So yeah, managing up, motivate. Oh, you're all smiling. You've all faced this. Everyone, please, what are your thoughts? And probably there's thoughts in the audience too. So please, everyone, post your thoughts.
Yeah, look, no, you go for it, mate. I just think.
I think there are 3 things that we do quite badly that we've got to change, and then there's a wider issue. Fear-mongering, I'm really pleased that point was made. The number of reports that I've seen that go to board levels that have the result of a pen test, 5 pages of red, critical, terrible, that talk about the fact that we put some number on the back of an envelope and we've worked out that we're going to have some productivity loss of 4 million a day if our IT systems are down. We have to actually break that reflex. There is obviously a need to make this seem like it's a credible concern, but we've got to have some science, we've got to have some approach. If you want to talk about what the realistic threats are to the organisation, spend some time, model it properly, quantify it properly. Make sure you've got buy-in from the people that actually drive that part of the business before you tell that part of the business that, hey, if this IT system goes down, you're losing millions of dollars per day, because you've got to take all of those stakeholders with you on the journey. Second thing I would say is cybersecurity is a fundamental problem, and that we're very good at speaking cybersecurity is a concern, but we can't speak the underlying risk language. Board senior management are very good at risk. They think about risk all the time. They think about their tolerances. They think about the matrices. They think about where and when they need to make certain investments. There is an entire universe of risk that they're looking at. And if we can actually talk about language in that term, the type of risk terminology that they're used to and that they're thinking about, you can naturally get buy-in. But a big part of risk is also being able to really clearly explain, what does that impact look like? What are the controls that we're doing to mitigate it? And what's that residual component that's left? We've got to have that end-to-end discussion, and increasingly, that's the bit that I find a lot of InfoSec professionals get a bit lost in. The third one that I'll say is, I actually think you do have a lot more board buy-in in the last 6 months than you ever had before. The focus within, for example, all of the AICD, the governance institutes, about cybersecurity obligations, not just on directors, but on gatekeepers. The fact that we see the constant media reporting of these incidences, the fact that pretty much everyone can speak to a director or a senior manager at another company they know that's had a data breach, who can tell them how terrible it is. You have that buy-in. What the people within your business want is, they want you to explain what the solution is. They don't want to be scared. They want you to give them the confidence. They want you to explain why they can sleep easier at night. what they're currently doing, what's falling out, and what they should do. So it's really about a whole messaging piece. The other bit that I'll just add, which is just a little bit more globally, is cybersecurity is scary. It's all encompassing. It's all terrifying. And I think one of the challenges we've got to do is we've got to accept that this is something where we don't need to use giant big red letters for the world is exploding, or we have to tone down the language. We have to make it more manageable, because again, we want buy-in, we want engagement. So I think that fear reflex that we sometimes use, I understand why people have used it, but more often than not, I see it being less helpful than actually helpful.
Thanks, Ben. That was great. And your 3 points turned into 4. You are an awesome lawyer. Lyria, you're waiting very patiently with your hand up. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to jump in and say that a lot of the same points that have been made about business and bringing business on board, I think also need to be made about policy. In other words, we don't need more reports that say ransomware is scary, it's awful, big threat, call out the big guns, and we need a lot more careful, considered thought about policy options and how they're going to work. I think you and I, Richard, have both now seen really good engagement at the department level in terms of, where cybersecurity policy could go and what might work and what might not work. It's interesting, I wanted to come back to this point right at the beginning, but it's interesting that Labor introduced a generally very good bill. There's been a little bit of critique of it in terms of reversing the onus of proof in one clause, but broadly, the idea of some kind of reporting being a really good policy first step, whether it's the only thing we do or not. There's plenty of other ideas out there. But it was also interesting that in introducing that bill, if you read the way it was introduced into Parliament, it was all Scott Morrison isn't doing anything on cybersecurity, the government's terrible, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not necessarily the kind of language that is going to get the government going, yes, this is a great policy idea, thanks for thinking of it, let's pass the bill. It's probably going to be the kind of language that's more likely to be a sort of like, well, we'll do anything but that now. So I think there's a real sense in which maybe we can think about, particularly in the context of ransomware and threats like that, a little bit more like how in Australia we've traditionally dealt with terrorism and national security and things, where it's less about partisan bickering and more about trying to work out what works and come up with the best solutions. So hopefully we will get there.
You and Ben are both lawyers, and you've both made this very interesting point really well, that this is not a technical problem you're seeing largely here. This is a communication problem, speaking the language and understanding stakeholders, communicating with them, bringing about change, being effective, and so on. And I think this is one really good thing about the Society of Computers in the Law. We should, as disciplines, be talking to each other. You guys are the masters of understanding, talking, empathy, persuasion. We're the masters of soldering little bits together and making things work. There are certainly technical people, and we're seeing them in the room here, who are also effective consultants, leaders, and persuaders too, but they don't necessarily go together. And there are, of course, computing people, legal people who are strong technically, but that doesn't have to be the case. I think it's a very fruitful partnership, and we both stand to learn a lot from each other. So I thank you both very much for that contribution. I think we'll now go to James. And James, please make your comment. And just to let everyone know, after you've finished, I'm going to ask each panel member to just say in 60 seconds or less, just maybe in just 3 words, what they think of the future, what the future holds, the things we should be thinking about as we go away today. But James, first of all, your comment.
No worries. Thanks for that, Richard. And just wanting to echo a few points that are front of mind. One is the risk language. We often look at security risk as a business risk, and I think aligning that with business conversations so that they can actually understand it and digest it, and therefore make informed decisions is really important. Just touching on what Ben mentioned around security, it's not a once-off exercise. It requires that watering and feeding and continuous investment. I think sometimes in the past, previously, it was we have this uplift program, it's done, we pull the plug on that investment, and then 3 years later they're back in the same position, which is what Ty was sort of alluding to as well. Also, cyber resources. Benjamin also mentioned we need to have an ability to scale and be able to bring in that expertise quickly. relationships with consultancies or retainers is really important there. One thing I would say, certainly from us in the education sector, is these resources are expensive. And they're, with all the borders locked down as well, it's hard to get a handle on some of that talent coming into the country. But certainly that's been a challenge. So obviously having an augmentation is really important. And then one area we probably haven't touched on a lot, but somewhat ties to what Lyria was talking about earlier around some of the government and policy statements around potentially getting into that mandatory reporting. One of the key things that we've been looking in is that a lot of these ransomware attacks are not just isolated or once-off. They're generally part of a campaign. And certainly for us in the sector, when we're looking at multiple institutions, we might see the same threat actor as part of a campaign hitting multiple institutions at once. So timely threat intelligence and threat intelligence sharing is really important as well. And maybe that's a role that us in the sector can play, but also with government, if there is mandatory reporting, getting those insights, getting that intelligence out there is in a timely fashion is really important, because we know that those indicators of compromise or whatever else are sort of valid for that short period of time, 24, 48 hours, and then their usefulness diminishes quite quickly. So yeah, those are the thoughts that I had just to wrap up, Richard.
That's fantastic, James. Each one of those points was quite separate and also quite fantastic. So thank you. Your sort of comments, in fact, the comments of everyone here are being picked up by people on the thread saying it's a journey, not a destination. Cybersecurity is a program, not a project. It's really a maturity model for us, isn't it? Just how we view cybersecurity. Robert wrote a lovely thank you to everyone there. Robert, it's so long, I haven't been able to read it all, but everyone should have a go at reading it. But it's very nice, thank you. And everyone that's been posting comments have been fantastic. And I'm sorry we only got to a small fraction of them. And the takeaway point for me is really what James said, that working together, we are stronger than individually. And that is particularly the case when the bad guys are operating at scale and themselves working together. So that you've all come along today, that you've all joined, that you've all helped each other with answers to the questions, that the presenters have been willing to come along and share with everyone and share their wisdom, is really part of us building a profession, a community. And I just love that. I think that's ultimately going to be our strength. Now, in the closing seconds, I'll go around in turn. If each of you could say somewhere between 1 to 3 words of what you'd like people to take away and think about. It might be about the future. Well, it is, because they'll think about it in the future. And Ben, is it right to start with you, or are you still thinking? I'm trying to read your face.
No, I'm fine.
Go.
My message is going to echo yours, which is this is cross-functional. I was super excited when AUSCL agreed to do this event, because it has to be at that join up of the legal, the risk, the technology, and the applied. And that's the approach that I recommend people take here. And no one has all the answers here. The people within your organization won't have all the answers, but by having those discussions, by building those connections, and by trying to get this out of just an IT security problem, that's where you will always get the best results here.
Thank you. So if we were to summarize that in just a few words, it's pretty cross-functional.
Agreed.
And something about it's more that the journey, not a destination sort of thing. Is that right? You don't like? Yeah. Thank you, Ben. That's great. Excellent. Ty, how about you?
Yeah, look, I don't think I can summarize it in 2 or 3 words, but I think that attacks will utilize more automation to really execute their campaigns more effectively. I think that every industry and company size is going to continue to struggle, because ultimately they're restricted by limited security resources and skills to be able to protect against a $2 trillion a year threat. And ultimately, with that sort of funding, cyber threats aren't going anywhere. They're going to continue to grow. And unfortunately, if you look at things like COVID, with the unprecedented sort of border closures and the controls that governments have had to do to step in a pandemic situation, if you put a lens on around, say, a cyber pandemic that we're in the middle at the moment, then there's going to need to be some pretty significant decisions that are going to be made over the next few years as to how we're actually going to protect, our businesses as a nation. And there are discussions around that in terms of, well, do countries actually disconnect their internet or have it extremely controlled to be able to prevent international attacks. Or on the flip side, personally, I think that big tech companies aren't going to let that happen. And do they step in and actually start soaking up organisations and hosting organisations just to deliver the level of security that's needed? So that'll be interesting to see play out. I think it's scary either way. We'll see what happens.
So I think your words are scary, automation, pandemic thinking. And I think you're spot on.
Yeah.
It is pandemic in so many ways, isn't it? We're learning so many lessons.
Yeah.
Oh, and sovereignty. I don't know if I said that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Ty. That was in fact a visionary. Now I know that's why you're entitled in your title. That's great. Thank you, James.
I will try and keep it to 3 words, which is just practice the plan.
You've just used them up.
That's it. Done. In the interest of time.
No, go. Say your words.
I'm just saying, practice the plan are the 3 words that I would probably highlight, which is really, and it's not all doom and gloom. It's really looking for opportunities as well. If as you go through your tabletops and exercises, there may be gaps that fall out of that. I see those as opportunities for improvement.
Okay, opportunities and plan. Practice the plan. That's a brilliant summary. Each of these summaries, when you say it, I think, oh yeah, you've exactly summarised today. It's brilliant. Lyria, you get the final words.
Get involved in policy. And the footnote to that is, even if you aren't a lawyer, and especially if you're not representing a particular corporate interest, I think that there's not enough voices in policy coming from technical experts to understand the situation, understand the solutions and the non-solutions and everything else. So get involved. Marina's posted about that from the society's perspective, because I know they're very involved in submissions. That's it. Get involved in policy.
Thank you. And that's an optimistic and great ghost of the future that you've given us. Thank you very much. There is hope and we can change. Thank you all, everyone. You've been a wonderful audience, a wonderful panel. Thank you very much to the Australian Society for Computers and Law. Marina, did you want to just say goodbye to everyone, and do we want to tell people the next 2 events that are happening?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Richard. My 3 words: fantastic, informative, and thanks. Thank you, Lyria, James, Ty, Ben, Richard, for a deep and practical session. And of course, our co-hosts, the Australian Computer Society, CAUDIT, and AISA. Mark Portlock for ensuring the event ran very smoothly. Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. It's a real relief having you on the team. And I'd now like to announce a number of our upcoming events. I actually don't see if it's on the screen yet. I'm assuming it is.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. Black Box AI is coming up shortly. You can see the link there on the screen and also in chat. You and the speakers there are also on the screen. Fantastic speakers. It will also be a fantastic informative session, I'm sure. Next one, please, Mark. And oh, that was quite a nice transition, but the numbers are missing. No problem. My fault completely. But there is a list of other events that are coming up. Maybe click through a bit, please, Mark. And fuel your passion, join our society. We're all volunteers. We're a registered educational charity and would love you to participate in our policy lab as well. So to do so, the first step is to subscribe to our mailing list, which is on the screen there. Again, thank you very much for our co-hosts and for each of you for joining us today, and to our wonderful panelists. Hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you all. It was wonderful.
Thanks, Richard.